you ever feel a chill crawl up your spine when the humid, heavy air of New Orleans settles in for the night? They say that some nights, when the fog rolls in thick from the bayou, you can still hear the faint, mournful strains of jazz music carrying a warning, a desperate plea from a time when the city held its breath in terror. It's a sound that echoes a nightmare, a memory of a phantom who walked the gaslit streets, an entity known only as the Axeman. In 1918, New Orleans was a city of contrasts, a vibrant tapestry of jazz clubs, Creole cottages, and shadowy alleyways. But beneath the lively veneer, a palpable fear began to fester, spreading like the Spanish flu that also haunted its citizens. It started in the Italian grocer community, small, tight-knit families who worked hard and kept to themselves. They were the first to learn that the city's lively nights could harbor a monstrous secret, one that entered homes not with a key, but with a chisel and a stolen axe. The nightmare began for Joseph and Catherine Maggio in the suffocating heat of a May night. An unseen figure forced a panel from their back door, slipping into the quiet sanctity of their home. There was no robbery, no sign of a struggle, only a scene of unimaginable brutality left behind. The weapon, an axe belonging to the Maggios themselves, was found discarded, stained with the life it had just stolen. The city awoke to a horror that felt deeply personal and terrifyingly random. As weeks turned into months, the attacks continued, each one a chilling echo of the last. A chiseled-out door panel, a sleeping family, and always the killer's favored instrument of death, an axe found within the victim's own home. The attacker was a ghost, leaving no fingerprints, no witnesses who could offer a clear description. He moved through the city like a phantom, a whisper of dread that turned every locked door into a fragile barrier against the encroaching darkness. Panic began to grip the Crescent City. The police were baffled, chasing shadows and dead-end leads. The newspapers sensationalized the killings, giving the nameless terror a title. The Axeman. His targets seemed to be Italian-American grocers, leading to theories of mafia involvement. But the sheer savagery of the attacks felt different, more personal, more unhinged than a simple mob hit. It was a methodical madness that defied all logic. The city's residents began to take matters into their own hands. Doors were reinforced, windows were boarded, and families slept in shifts, clutching whatever weapons they could find. The nights in New Orleans, once filled with the promise of music and revelry, were now saturated with a heavy, watchful silence. Every creak of a floorboard, every rustle in the alley, sent hearts pounding in chests, as people wondered if this was the night the Axeman would choose them. My story centers on a young musician named Louis, a trumpet player who made his living in the smoky jazz halls of the French Quarter. He lived with his younger sister, Elise, in a small apartment above a quiet bakery, far from the initial cluster of attacks. Louis was a man of logic and rhythm, not superstition. He dismissed the tales of the Axeman as exaggerated fears, the kind of dark folklore that a city like New Orleans loved to create. Elise, however, was not so dismissive. She was younger, more attuned to the city's undercurrent of fear. She read the grisly newspaper accounts with wide, terrified eyes, and insisted on barring their door each night with a heavy wooden plank. Louis would often tease her gently, telling her that her fear was more dangerous than any phantom killer. He believed the music they created could ward off any darkness, a charm more powerful than any lock. One sweltering August evening, as Louis was preparing to leave for his nightly gig, Elise was unusually quiet. She had spent the day listening to the whispers of neighbors, tales of a pregnant woman, Mrs. Schneider, who had been attacked but had miraculously survived. The Axeman had been close, too close. "He's getting bolder, Louis," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They say he's not even human. A demon." Louis simply smiled, kissed her forehead, and told her to keep the music playing. That night, the jazz club was less crowded than usual. The fear that had once been confined to the Italian neighborhoods was now a citywide contagion. Even the usually vibrant pulse of the music felt strained, as if the musicians were playing against a backdrop of collective anxiety. Louis played his trumpet with a forced bravado, the notes soaring high and clear, a defiant sound against the oppressive silence that seemed to be waiting just outside the club's doors. Walking home through the labyrinthine streets, Louis felt a prickle of unease for the first time. The familiar alleyways seemed to twist into unfamiliar shapes in the dim gaslight, and shadows danced like grotesque figures at the edge of his vision. He quickened his pace, the weight of his trumpet case a small comfort against the sudden, irrational fear that he was being watched, followed by something that defied the humid night air. He found Elise asleep in a chair by the phonograph, a jazz record spinning softly, its melody a fragile shield against the night. He smiled at her diligence, carefully lifted her, and carried her to her bed. As he secured the heavy plank across the door, a wave of protectiveness washed over him. For a moment, he understood her fear. The city felt different, wounded, and the music that was his life suddenly seemed like a very small defense. The encounter happened on a night thick with foreboding. Louis was awakened not by a sound, but by a sudden, unnatural cold that seeped into the room, chilling him to the bone. His eyes snapped open, and in the sliver of moonlight filtering through the window, he saw it. A tall, slender silhouette stood at the foot of his bed, a figure so dark it seemed to absorb the light around it. It was utterly still, watching him. Paralyzing fear seized him, rendering him mute and immobile. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the dead silence of the room. The figure held something in its hand, and as it shifted slightly, The moonlight glinted off the honed edge of an axe. It was his own wood-chopping axe, the one he kept by the hearth. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. The Axeman was in his home. He could hear Elise's soft breathing from the next room, and a surge of adrenaline cut through his terror. He had to protect her. The figure took a step, a slow, deliberate movement that was utterly silent. Louis could make out no features, just a void in the shape of a man, clad in dark clothing, and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed its face completely. It was a presence of pure, malevolent intent. Then, in early 1919, the terror escalated. A letter arrived at the offices of the Times-Picayune. A letter purportedly from the killer himself, written in a confident, taunting script. It was a direct challenge to the city. The author claimed not to be human, but a demon from the hottest hell. He mocked the police for their incompetence and declared that he would kill again. The letter contained a bizarre proclamation. The Axeman professed a deep love for jazz music. He announced that on the night of March 19th, at precisely 15 minutes past midnight, he would pass over New Orleans. He offered the citizens a strange clemency. Any home where a jazz band was in full swing would be spared. Those who chose not to jazz it out, he promised, would get the axe. The city was thrown into a frenzy of terrified preparation. It was an ultimatum from a monster, a demand that turned the city's signature art form into a tool for survival. For Louis, the letter was a chilling confirmation of his deepest fears. It felt like a personal message, a twisted perversion of the music he loved. The idea of playing not for joy or expression, but to appease a demon, filled him with a profound sense of dread. On the designated night, New Orleans transformed. The city, which had been cowering in fear, erupted in a cacophony of sound. Music spilled from every home, every dance hall, every corner bar. Professional and amateur bands played with a desperate energy, their melodies weaving together into a citywide shield of jazz. It was a celebration born of pure, unadulterated terror, a frantic prayer set to a swing rhythm. Louis and his fellow musicians played at a party in a wealthy Garden District mansion. The air was thick with a strange mixture of festivity and panic. People danced with frantic energy, their laughter a little too loud, their eyes darting nervously towards the windows. Louis played his trumpet until his lips were numb, each note a defiant shout into the night, a barrier of sound to keep the phantom at bay. And as the clock ticked past midnight, no murders were reported. The city breathed a collective sigh of relief, but the peace was short-lived. The Axeman, it seemed, was not a being to be so easily placated. The attacks resumed, random and brutal, leaving the citizens to wonder if the night of jazz had been anything more than a madman's cruel joke. The fear returned, colder and deeper this time, for they had played his game, and still the monster walked among them. For Louis, the world had changed. The music he once saw as a source of light now felt tainted by darkness. He became as cautious as Elise, triple-checking the locks and the heavy plank on their door each night. He found himself scanning the faces in the crowds at his gigs, wondering if the Axeman was watching, listening, enjoying the fear he had orchestrated. The phantom was no longer just a story. It was a constant, oppressive presence. The confrontation came on a night when a storm was brewing, the air heavy and electric. Louis was jolted from a restless sleep by the sound he had dreaded for months. The splintering of wood. It was a single, sharp crack from the direction of their back door. He sat bolt upright, his blood turning to ice. A floorboard creaked in the kitchen. He was here. He was inside, moving with a silence born of pure terror. Louis slipped out of bed. His mind raced, searching for a weapon, a plan, anything. His gaze fell upon the heavy brass base of his music stand. It was clumsy, but it was solid. He crept towards his bedroom door, his heart pounding a deafening rhythm in his ears. He could hear Elise stir in her room, a soft whimper of fear in her sleep. He peered through the crack in the door and saw the silhouette again, darker than the surrounding shadows, moving with an eerie grace towards Elise's room. In its hand, the glint of the axe was a cold, silver promise of death. There was no time to think. With a guttural cry that was part rage and part terror, Louis burst from his room, swinging the heavy brass stand with all his might. The stand connected with the figure's shoulder with a sickening thud. The Axeman staggered, letting out a grunt of what might have been surprise or pain. It was the first sound Louis had ever heard it make, a guttural, inhuman noise. The figure turned, and for a fleeting second, Louis saw the face beneath the hat's brim, or rather, the lack of one. It was a shifting canvas of deep shadows, a featureless void that radiated an almost physical cold. Elise screamed from her doorway, the sound shattering the night's tension. The shadowy figure hesitated, its non-face turning from Louis to the sound of his sister's terror. It raised the axe, not in aggression, but almost as if in confusion. In that moment of distraction, Louis swung again, this time aiming for the head. The figure ducked with unnatural speed, the stand whistling through the empty air where its head had been. The creature did not retaliate. Instead, with a speed that seemed to defy the laws of physics, it moved towards the back of the apartment. It didn't run, it flowed, a river of shadow pouring through the darkened rooms. Louis watched, frozen, as it reached the shattered back door and dissolved into the torrential rain and the inky blackness of the alleyway beyond, vanishing as if it were never there. Louis and Elise huddled together in the aftermath, trembling, the splintered door a stark reminder of their brush with the impossible. The police came, of course, and found only the discarded axe on the kitchen floor. They took Louis's statement with a mixture of disbelief and weary resignation. To them, he was just another terrified citizen whose fear had conjured a faceless monster from the shadows. The attacks stopped as abruptly as they had begun in the autumn of 1919. The Axeman simply vanished, leaving a city scarred by his reign of terror and a dozen unsolved crimes in his wake. No one was ever caught, no credible suspect ever identified. The phantom melted back into the folklore of New Orleans, a terrifying footnote in its long and storied history of ghosts and dark legends. Louis never spoke of the faceless void he confronted in his apartment. How could he? Who would believe that he had fought not a man of flesh and blood, but something other, something that belonged to the oppressive, suffocating darkness between the gaslights? He and Elise moved away from the city not long after, seeking a place where the nights were not filled with such heavy memories. Yet Louis could never truly escape. He gave up playing the trumpet, for the sound of jazz was forever linked to that night of citywide fear, and his personal confrontation with the darkness. The melody that had once been his salvation was now a haunting refrain, a reminder of the faceless evil that had walked the streets of his city, demanding a terrified serenade. Years later, as an old man living hundreds of miles away, Louis would sometimes wake in the dead of night, his heart pounding with a familiar, icy dread. He would swear he could hear it, faint and distant, carried on the night breeze, the mournful, desperate sound of a lone trumpet playing jazz, a sound that wasn't a celebration, but a warning. And he would wonder if the Axeman had ever truly left New Orleans. Or was it still there, a patient, timeless entity lurking in the shadows of the bayou? Perhaps it was just waiting, listening for the music to stop, waiting for the night when the city would once again fall silent, ready to be visited by its most terrifying demon.